Hello and welcome to North Country Matters. My name is Paige Smith and I'm a student majoring in communication and media at Clarkson University. Today we are hosting a conversation with Carl Normand, the Section 10 Athletic Coordinator for St. Lawrence Lewis-BOCES. Joining him in conversation is Donna Seymour of the St. Lawrence County branch of the American Association of University Women, who serves as the Public Policy Vice President for AAUW of New York State. Welcome. Donna, will you get us started?
Thank you, Paige. My guest this week is Carl Normandin. He's the Section 10 Athletic Coordinator. Carl works for BOCES, and you're actually responsible for more schools in Section 10 than our local BOCES has in its orbit. Carl, can you take a few minutes and explain to us what you do, how the athletic sections are set up in New York State, please?
Sure. Yes, Donna. Our BOCES is responsible for not only 18 schools in St. Lawrence Lewis County, but we have 6 schools over in Franklin County. Mm-hmm. Our primary purpose is to kind of serve and assist the direction or the schools in rules interpretations, state education department rules and regulations, and then state athletic associations rules and regulations. So we kind of work in collaboration with the 24 athletic directors. The state of New York is broken up into 11 sections, as far south as Long Island, as far west as Buffalo, mm-hmm. and as far north as Plattsburgh and St. Lawrence County. And within those, each section, you're responsible for those component districts.
Okay. Actually, when you're talking about athletics, you're not only talking about the rules that the schools have to follow, but there's also things that the state requires, and there's things that the federal government requires. And that's a little bit about what we're talk about tonight with Title IX and gender equity, and how that actually, those rules impact what the schools do and have to do for students and to provide these opportunities. Carl has brought along a PowerPoint slideshow that he put together. Carl, how do you use these slides in your normal work? Do you use these to educate athletic directors, parents, and students?
Yeah, we try and cover the gamut, whether it's athletic directors, school administrators, parents, coaches, and student athletes, because Title IX really cuts across the grain for all of those that are involved in the ownership of high school athletics.
Would this be something that, for example, a school would do with a group of students and parents at the beginning of a season? Because you've got 3 basic seasons during the school year.
Correct. Yeah, it could be utilized during any of the, we call them parent orientation mm-hmm. meetings that deal specifically with athletics, both at the modified and the JV and varsity levels. So if there's questions with regards to Title IX or sport mm-hmm. offerings, and try and clean up some of the misconceptions with regards to Title IX and athletics, this is where these slides could come in handy for a district.
Well, I sat through many of those orientations myself when my children were in school, and the ones who played sports, and we didn't have anything like this at that time. So this is a big step forward, I think, in terms of parent education, and also in terms of letting students know what their rights are and what the school's responsibilities are to provide these opportunities. So let's roll the slides, if we may, please, and we'll start going through them and talking about the information that you have to present to us this evening.
Sure.
So the first slide is just Title IX and gender equity, and what's it all about. And so what is it all about, Carl?
Well, really it deals with fairness and equity. Mm-hmm. And I use the term equity not necessarily in terms of equal, because there's always the misconception that if there's something wrong or something's not being offered, whether it's a male sport and a female sport, mm-hmm. that they need to be equal. And as we get deeper into our conversation, you'll see a couple of slides that actually illustrate the term proportionality.
Right, right. And those are the rules that were set up by the federal government in order to give schools several tools to assess the program that they were doing.
Correct.
So quite basically, let's just run through the definition of Title IX. It's a very short law written into the Education Amendments of 1972, and I don't think anybody at the time had any idea the power, the impact, and the downrange effect that it would have on schools and on opportunity.
Definitely. Can't actually see the slide.
That's okay. It says, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Now, a little bit of Title IX trivia. That was actually signed into law by President Nixon. He signed it into law on June 23rd, 1972. That happened to be the day I graduated from high school. Oh, wow. So, of course, that meant that Title IX for my generation didn't exist. Interestingly enough, people will tell you that it takes about a generation for a law or a policy to actually get fully into effect, which meant that when it was my own children's turn to be in high school, Title IX was in effect, and it had fully permeated, certainly at the high school level, education. So I really could see the benefit by the time they had gotten into high school of how Title IX had really opened many, many doors for them.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the 70s and the 80s were definitely the hallmark for the influence or effect of Title IX. And probably to some degree, I don't think sometimes our kids actually realize today, where they were and where we're at now and the benefits that they can reap from it.
That's true. One of the purposes of our conversation, Carl, is to hone in, of course, on Title IX. But can you also take just a minute to talk about some of the other federal and state laws that require schools in terms of having someone to report to, what the process is? We have Title IX, which is federal. The Reauthorized Violence Against Women Act also is going to have some effect on some reporting. And the Dignity for All Students Act here in New York State is another piece that schools have to operate under. So how does the mechanics of reporting under those three sets of laws work for a school?
Yeah, pretty much there has to be, a person in place within the district. There has to be a policy approved by the Board of Educations. There needs to be notice of that policy amongst the parents, students, and administration. And then certainly the students must be aware of the policy and a grievance procedure in place as well. All of those really need to be in place. The actual reporting of instances of violence, abuse, or discrimination, again, they would have to find, if it's a student athlete, they'd have to find the point person. Typically, it might even be their coach. Their coach would then notify probably the principal or athletic director, and then they would in turn find the direct contact within the district and then follow up with the actual report.
Is there a requirement, for example, that on a district website that you could type in Title IX in a search engine and that chain of reporting would be available to you?
Yes, that would be one of the other mediums that people or students could look up and find out who that person is. And in some situations, it might even be the school nurse or a school teacher. Right. But again, the primary function would be is they've got to find that direct Title IX representative within the district.
One other question along those lines, in the event that, you don't like to see it happen, but sometimes athletes might have a problem with their coach, so they would need a way to go around the person that they wanted to report on. If it turned out to be that person was in the direct chain of reporting to, you need multiple avenues.
Right, yeah, and those are items that would be discussed within their parent-teacher, student-athlete orientation meetings. Okay. Whether it's a coach, they could report it to their athletic director or the school principal or somebody they're just plain comfortable with discussing whatever the matter might be.
And I believe, I also understand that under New York State, every building has to have someone to report to, and then so that if you've got a 3-building district, like for example we have here in Potsdam, there'd be 3 people at the building level plus a district person.
Correct, correct. Every building must have a representative.
Okay. Well, let's move on to our next slide, and this we'll talk about what Title IX covers. And so that's a variety of issues: athletics and extracurriculars, access to courses and programs, counseling, student rules and policies, treatment of pregnant or parenting students, and there must be a sexual harassment policy, both covers students and employees in the district. What can you add to that in terms of when you are counseling your coaches and the building administrators that you do with through BOCES? Do you have a role in checking to make sure that they have made each one of those areas covered by school policy?
Our office personally doesn't have the authority or jurisdiction to check on those. Our job basically is to serve as the liaison to the coaches that we provide coaching education to. So we remind the coaches whether or not they're teacher coaches in district or non-teacher coaches that these policies apply, whether it's an after-school function, whether you're on the road, whether you're at the hotel, at somebody else's venue, that all those policies and procedures are in place when you're in an interscholastic activity.
Okay. So that could be debate club, it could be
any extracurricular.
Hockey. Yeah, right. So they're all covered no matter what. If it's a school function, you're covered.
Correct. As simple as school field trip, an overnighter, a day trip, going to the Vic Center at Paul Smith's, the same policies, codes of conduct apply.
Okay, that's good to know. One thing I'd like to talk with you a little bit about, Carl, is the rules that Title IX covers for pregnant and parenting students. I know that certainly doesn't come under your jurisdiction as the athletic coordinator, but it is something that Title IX covers, and I do think it's useful for people to know a little bit about what those rules are, what a student's rights are, what the district must provide in the circumstance that someone might find themselves needing that kind of protection.
Sure. I think probably first and foremost is you don't treat the individual any different than any other person in the district. They still have the same rights, responsibilities, and probably in some cases even maybe a little bit more given the unique situation. Right. You certainly can't discriminate. You certainly can't harass. You certainly can't put them in an intimidative type of a situation, pressure to remove them from a squad or not try out. Again, you got to treat them just like you would any other student in your district. Pretty much as long as there's a proper protocol with the school physician, the family physician, or whoever that person is responsible for outside of the confines of the school, the individual can still participate up until it's safe and not appropriate for them to continue to participate. But again, that's really out of the hands of I would say the school per se. That's really a consult between the school physician and the young lady's family physician or school doctor.
Okay, good. One thing that we should be talking about is the areas of Title IX. It's a very broad law. It covers a lot of things, but there are a few areas that seem to get the most attention. So could you kind of highlight those for us?
Sure. Athletics, program offerings, coaching hirings, facilities. Again, as the regulation reads, basically it just needs to be fair across the board. Athletic offerings need to be of a similar nature. Budgets don't necessarily have to be equal, but they need to be proportional based on the student population. Anytime there's an addition or a deletion of a particular sport, again, there should be some type of a survey to canvass the students to find out what they really enjoy participating in. It just can't be made in an arbitrary manner to just say, we're going to take this out of our athletic repertoire, and sorry for the 45 people that it may impact.
Yeah, exactly.
And the facilities, you can't have a field that has no grass on it, and maybe one dugout and half a backstop, and you have a state-of-the-art baseball diamond. So I've got an illustration in one of the slides as well that addresses the facility. So
one of the areas under this is discipline in terms of rules and policies. Are there specific discipline rules that might apply to athletes that wouldn't apply to another student, or does that have to be pretty much across the board?
No, that's a really good question. Actually, the state education department, I won't say permits, but for lack of a better term, they hold interscholastic athletic student athletes to a higher standard, so that's why they have a code of conduct that they have to sign. And basically, it's a participation type of an agreement, and they can be held to a higher standard than the general student population.
Okay.
You know, we use the term academic eligibility. If a student drops below a 2.5 or whatever the district's criteria is, they can remove those athletic privileges, whereas if you're a typical student and don't have any extracurricular activities kind of hanging over you, there's really no type of a consequence. So that's really the only distinction, and maybe a student code of conduct that would distinguish, you know, a criteria for you know, what you can hold a student athlete to a general student population.
Okay. I know one thing that the section is very good at is recognizing the academic student athletes at the end of each season. You always see those awards going out not only for their athletic prowess, but the ones who've also maintained a very good academic standard. So that's a nice reinforcement of the privileges and the responsibilities of that.
Definitely, yeah. We take pride, a great deal of pride in truly the student athlete, student first, athlete second. And yeah, the criteria is 88 or above cumulative average over the course of their sophomore, junior, and senior year. So they've got to maintain a pretty high standard to achieve that accomplishment. And you know, every year that standard seems to be being reached by our student population. And yeah, we recognize them just as if it's just as important as recognizing the MVPs. That's and
right.
You know, the other unique awards that come to each particular sport.
What you reward is what you value, and that sends an important message to students. Title IX requires several things. It requires there to be a self-evaluation process, which is for the district. It requires the appointment of a responsible person, someone to report to. You have to develop policies, you have to notify people about your policies, and there has to be an established grievance procedure. All of those things give a school district the framework under which to offer athletics, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Who gets to play? Who gets to play?
Everybody, as long as they pass a medical clearance, they're entitled to try out per se. Depending on the district, there are tryouts and cup policies, but basically everybody, including students with disabilities, are entitled to the same opportunities as the general student population. Excuse me. I forgot the direction I was going to go with that question.
Well, a question for you along that lines, and I know you can talk about this from Section 10. What percentage of students on average do you see actually playing athletics in schools?
Well, we're pretty unique up here. We did a survey probably about 4 years ago with student interest survey and who participates and who doesn't. The Athletic Association does a participation survey annually that all the districts have to report. And we have upwards of 85% in some of our districts, primarily our smaller districts, to about 65% in our larger districts. And across the state, that's probably one of the higher percentages for students participating in interscholastic athletics.
Well, that's a great participation rate, and it also means that you must be offering sports and programs that students are really interested in if they're going to that
definitely
that number.
Yeah, we've had a number of districts do surveys with the addition of some sports. Women's ice hockey is a sport that's taken off in the last decade. Women's lacrosse has taken off at the high school level, at least locally for us. So, you know, based on those interests, for some it might not be as quick as they want it to, but the districts are listening and are making progress.
That's great. One of the things that we have to talk about, of course, is money. As we all know, school districts are in tight financial times and have been for some time. Athletic department budgets. What are the rules as far as splitting your money between girls' sports and boys' sports?
Sure. There is a regulation which does fall under Title IX with regards to the percentage of females and the percentage of males and the sport offerings that are being offered. Our districts on an annual basis pretty much canvass the student population, and again, we refer to them as beds numbers, which again identifies the student enrollment in the district. So based on those numbers, we'll determine what and how many levels of sport offerings that we can have. In the last several years, just due to our economy and people not being in the area, we've actually downsized, but it's been downsized across the board for sport offerings. But again, based on the percentage of women in the school and men in the school, you know, the programs are offered at those proportional rates.
Right. A question I have for you, Carl, is when, for example, two smaller schools merge for the purposes of to play a sport. For example, they don't have quite enough students maybe to field a football team, but if they combine with another neighboring school, they do. How does Title IX rules apply in that case? For example, if a student from school A is playing a sport at school B because they're the home team, whose Title IX director does that student report to?
From an academic or code of conduct area, the home district would still be responsible for the student in that capacity. But from a reporting and recording standpoint, it would be the host school that would be responsible for documenting that, you know, if we have 50 football players, however 5 of them come from a neighboring district, they absorb those 5, and that's how it's calculated in the figures.
Okay, but if a student had a problem, would he work through the host school or the home school? For example, if he had an issue that needed to be worked through on a Title IX type basis for a complaint, home school, host school?
It would probably fall initially on the home, or I should say the host school.
The host school, okay.
But with that being said, I think the 2 districts would probably have to collaborate on that, on that concern that the student athlete may have.
And this relates to our earlier conversation. In terms of a school merger, if 2 schools decide to physically merge their operations, much, for example, as Potsdam and Canton right now are in discussions looking at how they might merge, in a case like that, what would happen to athletic budgets, and even more importantly, what would happen to opportunity for 2 schools to merge? Because obviously they'd still only have one track team, they'd only have one soccer team. Do we reduce the number of opportunities? How does that work?
Well, I think in some vein you'll probably see a reduction in areas, but I also think you'll see gains in other areas.
Okay.
Whereas in some sports you might only offer a modified and a varsity program, you could add a 3rd level in there, the junior varsity program, or even it is permissible to have, if you have based on the numbers that you have at, let's say, the 7th and 8th grade level, you could actually have multiple modified sport teams.
Okay.
They just couldn't compete against one another.
Okay.
I think both districts are doing their due diligence to try and foresee some of those issues that are coming up. But again, I think for the most part, by merging the 2, because if you only have a handful of kids and you're having limited substitutions, you know, it makes it very difficult for these kids to participate on a daily and seasonal basis.
Right, because you can see that the overall number of opportunities might decrease when you merge 2 student bodies. Right. So that, I think, is a concern as we move forward through. A lot of districts are looking at creative solutions to solve some of their financial problems and offer educational opportunities that, as a very small district, they can't offer by themselves. Sure. So I think this is definitely something that's going to be on a lot of people's minds as they work through some of these questions.
Yeah, and actually the State Athletic Association just created a committee to look at combined schools and mergers. We've had our first of monthly meetings to discuss, do we see more evidence of schools merging sport to sport level, whether it's individual sport, team sport, and we're recording all of those, reporting them to the Athletic Association. And right now, from first glance, is that this is just not a North Country issue. This is an
Right.
issue that's across the state, not just with small schools, but we're also seeing it some of the larger schools that might be 15 miles apart and have two very large high schools, but just financially can't continue to operate based on the current financial aid packages and taxes that the districts are paying. So.
And I think it's safe to say that the financial problems aren't going to go away
They're not going
anytime
away.
soon. So these questions are going to have to be answered, and it's good that your organization is taking a broad picture look at that. That's going to be very helpful, I think, down the road. Well, we've come to the two slides that are called laundry list. So. And I can certainly remember from when my kids played soccer that laundry was an issue, especially at the end of the season.
True.
So the schools have to do surveys about interest and abilities. There's the question of equipment and supplies, the scheduling, which is, I suppose, with as many districts as you have to cover in Section 10, that can be quite a nightmare.
It's especially this particular winter. It's been probably the toughest in the 13 years in this position with scheduling. And you're right, Title IX does cover all of those aspects with regards to scheduling. You can't just kind of give the prime time slots to what would traditionally be a male slot. It needs to be divvied out, and we alternate all of our schedules in every single sport. If it's a male, female, a Monday, Thursday, and a Tuesday, Friday, and we flip-flop halfway through the season. And,
Okay.
we do the same thing with our playoff formats. We try and highlight separate exclusive evenings for the females, and we try and do the same thing for the males. And
so that they aren't competing one against the
one
other in
another.
terms of either for a parent's attention or for the people who want to come out and support that. And the same rules apply for travel arrangements and opportunities for coaching and for academic support if the students need them. I'm assuming those rules also cover things like coaches' salaries and those other kinds of ancillary costs.
Definitely. A lot of those items are covered in their contracts that they have, particularly at the high school level. Maybe not necessarily at the collegiate level, but you can't hire a coach for a women's sport and pay them any less than what you would be paying the complement of a men's sport or male sport in that particular sport. There might be discrepancies within sport to sport, but not within the sport.
Okay. Well,
so a basketball coach should be getting paid the same thing that the men's basketball
Right.
coach is over the same time frame.
And there's supposed to be comparable things like locker rooms and the condition of the fields.
Correct.
And practice times and playing times have to be equally divvied out too.
Correct.
So in terms of how the athletes themselves are treated, there's not supposed to be any differences either. I mean, that's something that they have to work really hard to make sure that there's no either perceived or real differences.
Correct. I mean, even delivery of instruction, terminology, you need to be mindful of that. Everyone should be treated the same, and if there's not, then certainly the administration or who's ever responsible for the athletic department needs to intervene, and if it reaches a point that there is some type of a grievance, then they need to seek out that person and highlight and figure out what needs to be rectified in that.
Is this something that your office provides in terms of that kind of training and help in figuring out what may or may not be appropriate and trying to fix problems that have arisen?
We don't necessarily try to solve the problem for them. We're more of the sounding board where you have that person that's uncomfortable about maybe going to the coach or going to the athletic director. Our office seems to be the conduit to receive those phone calls, and then our job is to try and steer them to the particular contact person and try and get it resolved at the lowest level as possible. And then, if need be, follow up with the district to make sure that everything seems to be in place.
That must give you a pretty good sense of the pulse of some of the issues that are out there in the districts in terms of, is there anything that you see that is a common complaint or not?
I wouldn't necessarily say there's a common complaint, particularly with Title IX. Usually what happens is if there's a group of individuals that want to start up a sport and they're seeking an avenue to try and get that to happen, we get a call whether or not it's starting a women's lacrosse team, or years ago, as quick as a decade ago, it was the advent of girls ice hockey at the Interscholastic, and we try and work with those, whether it's a parent group, a booster, or the district themselves, to try and get that established. And the same thing with the deletion or elimination of a sport. You know, it is in the back of their minds, and they want to make sure that they are in compliance if in fact they do have to delete a sport.
Let's go through the rules that districts have to follow in terms of determining proportionality. In other words, when they're self-assessing themselves, what are the three rules that Title IX, what are the three avenues for self-assessment that Title IX gives a district?
Sure. Again, you've got to look at the composite of the district, male to female ratio. Make sure that your offerings are in line with that proportion. If your population is 70% female, 30% male, the sport offerings or the extracurricular offerings should be, if they're gender specific, need to be in that proportion. You'll have to give me a hand on the second. I forgot the second one up.
Here, this is your cheat sheet. Go right ahead.
Yeah, it was, as we mentioned earlier, the history and continuing practices of adding and deleting a sport. Again, that needs to be done in the same manner based on the student population. And then just trying to accommodate the students' interests. I know recently we had one of our component districts. Everybody thought the big push was to start women's ice hockey. After they did their self-assessment and had the student surveys submitted, lo and behold, it was girls lacrosse was the hot ticket for that particular district. And
interesting.
The district's been working on establishing a foothold to get girls lacrosse started.
It must be difficult, too, when you've got a district that wants to do that and there's no neighboring districts with that program. Sometimes it's kind of a multi-district task, isn't it, to get a new sport established? Yeah, and I must say our districts up here are very accommodating. Usually it's a simple phone call, a discussion of, well, how can we help you, whether it's students, whether it's transportation. There's been mergers that have been in place long before I was up here that still are in existence, and it's just been, you know, that's the way we do business, and that is one thing that's unique up here. One of the questions I think that always comes up when you're talking about this, what qualifies an activity as a sport versus a club or another kind of Sure, that's a great question. That's probably one of the more common questions that we get at the office, particularly at the start of each sports season. Sometimes it's a little too late to get things going, but really the litmus test is it an activity or is it a competition? Cheerleading is probably the prime example right now, where actually the State Education Department and the State Athletic Association are hopefully by July 1 will declare cheerleading as a sport as long as it meets the definition of meeting the competition. And there'll be a separation between spirit cheer and then the stunts and tumbling competitive cheer. So more the gymnastic side of things. Correct. Okay, because that has always been a gray area for forever. And I know back when dinosaurs ruled the earth and I was in high school, I looked through my old yearbook, and there was girls track and girls basketball and girls soccer, and the only other really activity there was cheerleading. And so, but that was not by any means the gymnastic type of cheerleading. So it really, there were very few opportunities. Correct, and and it didn't meet the other criteria. It's not in a defined season. Spirit doesn't fall in the definition of competitive, which the stunts and tumbling. That's probably going to be the next big effort, is to make sure that everybody understands that the sideline spirit cheer is not necessarily the stunts and tumbling, the competitive cheer. The competitive cheer will have a defined season. There is a rule book and a handbook that goes along with that. The coaches need to be certified in that area, and it'll fall under the athletic directors or the athletic department's responsibility. The coach will no longer be, quote, the advisor. They'll actually be a coach. And presumably for a better salary. Correct. As well. Correct. So they'll fall under, and in some there is a debate because they still want to have their
their autonomy, but truly the competitive, the stunts and tumbling aspect of it will be a defined season. It'll wind up being in the winter season.
Is there any, are there any schools doing that now so that you've got a base to draw on, or are people going to have to develop those programs?
We have a pretty good, I'd probably say about 2/3 of our districts have,
Okay.
quote, the Spirit Squad typically that takes place in fall for support for football. And I guess that's the other distinction too would be, is cheerleading support or is it an actual standalone? The support would be your typical sideline cheerleaders for sport of basketball, sport of football. The separate standalone would be your stunts and tumbling that would have designated gym time, designated competitions, exclusive of any other activity.
Okay, okay. Having that, and you say you think by the end of this school year that those rules will be in place?
Yeah, it's been with the commissioner for about a year and a half. The association has done a comprehensive survey. They're actually offering regional, quote, events. They won't call them competitions yet, they're events until it's truly been recognized.
Okay.
But yeah, and this was based on the request of a number of athletic directors and school superintendents to kind of rein in some of the programs that really have gone full bore but really have nothing to really hold them back because they're kind of in an ancillary type of a program.
Right, right. So this will give structure to the whole operation in a way
Definitely.
that you haven't had before.
Definitely.
Let's talk a little bit about common misperceptions about Title IX. We know they're out there, and we know they're legion in many ways. So, what does Title IX require or not require in terms of adding and or eliminating programs? Because a lot of people like to blame Title IX if a program gets dropped. That may be dropped because there's not enough students to play the sport, or because financially something had to give.
Right. Yeah, in some respects it's probably taken a black eye, and by no means does Title IX mean if you're trying to balance out your program offerings and you're out of compliance, that in order to get in compliance you've got to cut a traditional male sport. That's not what the law requires.
Right.
It's basically illustrating you need to provide an additional opportunity for the females to balance out the sport offerings. You know, with that being said, I'm sure we're still going to have to fight that fight that because a sport was cut, it was because of Title IX, and it's far from the case.
Right, and I think probably these days it's finances more than anything that is creating havoc with athletic budgets for districts.
Yeah, finances and enrollment, and you know as well as I do, we're not getting an influx of people into the North Country, let alone New York State. And so yeah, finances and then just basic enrollment. If you don't have enough to field a team and have appropriate subs, which is the other part, you might be able to get 5 basketball players.
That's for safety as much as anything else, which I think a lot of times people forget. I know it's tough right now for football. A lot of high school football squads, you have people playing both offense and defense. So that means they're never getting a rest. They're always on the field.
Correct.
On one side of the line or the other.
Correct. So. Yeah, and carrying the bare minimum of 18 players, and you're putting 11 on a line. That means there's only 8 on the sideline. So
right.
it does become a safety factor.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, when you see so much work is being done now with things like concussion in football and also in soccer because of heading the ball.
Correct.
But sometimes those rests keep people from making mistakes and getting hurt.
Right.
So without having that, I think one of the things that we need to talk about is that certainly I've seen this in the last 40 years in terms of what we expect, society expects to be offered to boys. Athletics has always been around. It seems like it's one of those things that no one even thinks about. It's a given. And we've seen gradually over the years that people have begun to expect that same level of opportunity for girls, and which is a wonderful thing because sports teaches lessons that you can't learn any other way, and particularly about teamwork and goal setting and things like that. So it's important that both our young men and our young women have those opportunities. It's really, there's a lot of strategy that goes in though into building those opportunities. You really have to think about them in a very comprehensive way, don't you, for a district? It's not
Definitely.
something that just falls off the tree all by itself.
Right. Yeah, and it's getting increasingly more difficult. Again, with our shrinking enrollments, you're dealing with the safety. Some of the sports require a great deal of cost based on the nature of the sport. Helmets, reconditioning of helmets, uniforms, whether or not your sport requires a home and an away uniform. The Title IX application, I guess I'll refer to, would be equal. I won't say the only thing that needs to be equal, but the expenditures need to be expended at a proportional rate as well. The sport of football is substantially greater than offering the sport of girls swimming. You know, girls swimming, you're looking at pool time, you're looking at transportation, coach's salary, versus the sport of football with helmet reconditioning, pads, multiple coaches. So I guess the big misconception is that everything needs to be equal. And it's not necessarily equal, it needs to be proportional based on the sport and the expenditure of the sport.
But in the same token, a school can't get away with just offering cheap sports to girls and expensive sports to boys.
You are correct.
That's one thing that the people who are doing the financial number crunching can't get away with that one.
Right.
And another thing that actually comes into this that you might not think about at first glance is school booster clubs also have to provide that same level of support and opportunity. They can't just be funding the football team, can they?
Yeah, and I kind of equate that to the large university model where you have a donor that wants to donate to a specific sport for funding or support of a sport. A high school you can take a donation, but it can't be earmarked.
Right.
It has to go into the fund that's designated for interscholastic athletics.
And then apportioned out equally.
Portioned out equally. And that's probably one of the biggest misnomers out there is if I pay $50 for the soccer program, it's earmarked for soccer. No, it goes into that fund that has to be proportioned out.
Let's just mention very briefly that next week is National Girls and Women in Sports Day, which is the 28th annual. And so we'll be looking forward to that in terms of as a great way to highlight women's sports. And my friend Paige is coming in. So Paul, thank you so much. It's been so interesting. We've learned so much about Title IX. Thank you for your time tonight.
I'm sorry our time is up. Thank you all. These conversations are a production of North Country Matters, produced here in the studios at WCKN of the campus of Clarkson University. This show is a civic collaboration between the St. Lawrence County branch of the American Association of University Women, the St. Lawrence County League of Women Voters, and the Communication and Media Department of Clarkson University. Until next time, remember, our North Country matters. Thank you.
Thanks, Paige.
Thank you.
We didn't get as far.